It's story time.
All right, Jen, are you familiar with like how the movie Rocky starts? The old one, we've talked about Rocky on the pod before. Do you remember how the original Rocky, like, I guess it doesn't start, but like plays out when he's getting ready for his big fight?
All I remember from like the original Rocky is him running upstairs to Philadelphia. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's definitely in Philly. You got to
Okay,
get
okay.
that right. Philly listener needs you to know that.
Okay, so yeah, he's running up the stairs in some gray old school sweat outfit.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He looks vintage. He looks vintage.
Okay,
But
okay.
he's getting ready for the fight, and that's a pretty legit 80s, montage sort of thing. Like he's punching all these beef sides, like in the back of like meat lockers. He's pounding down raw eggs. I mean, heck, he even marries his like high school sweetheart, so his head's like
Right.
fully in the game. Like in terms of like what we're talking about today, think about like Japan is Rocky. Japan is showing up for this epic war that we're about to break down today, like just fully in the zone. Meanwhile, Russia goes about things all differently. Like if I had to describe Russia, it'd be like a single dude in his
Okay.
like late 20s, early 40s, but you can't really tell because he's not really taking care of himself.
Okay,
Sitting
gotcha.
in like a studio apartment, like threadbare couch, just playing Warzone until like 4:30 in the morning against somebody in like Uzbekistan, just eating all sorts of like processed cheeses, like the powdery
Ugh,
cheeses, cheese whiz, powder cheese and cheese whiz together, and then just like
disgusting.
finding people on Twitter or some sort of social media platform and trying to slide into their DMs every now and then, like no one's gonna notice. Like that's how Russia's going about this thing.
So what you're saying is Russia and Japan are going to fight each other, and Japan is, talking the talk, walking the walk, doing all the hard work to get ready. And Russia is this like 35-year-old who lives in his mom's basement getting ready to fight by playing war games.
Yeah, but
Okay.
I don't even know if
All
like
right.
getting ready to fight, like getting ready to LARP, I think would be a better way of describing how Russia goes about this thing. So
Well, then this
I'm
should be an
excited.
interesting story to tell.
Oh, this is a good one. I think we can have some fun with this one. Let's go ahead and get into this thing because I can't wait. I just can't wait any longer.
Hey, everybody. Welcome again to Storytime with the Historists, the podcast for world history students, teachers, and enthusiasts. It's world history, but told our way. And this week, you guessed it, continuation of our discussion on the Russo-Japanese War. Now, if you haven't listened to part one of the series, we highly suggest stopping and listening to that first. A lot of context, a lot of good background information. But if you are the type of person like me who just likes to hop right into a story, well, then we hope you enjoy part two, World War Zero. All right, Matt, where did we last leave off?
So when last we left off, Russia had insinuated itself into Japanese business. Japan had just won the first Sino-Japanese War. They had gotten Manchuria. Specifically, they got this Port Arthur, that totally pissed off the Russians because the Russians wanted this warm water port. So the Russians start shaking the sword, is what they used to say back in the day, starting to get after it a little bit. And the Japanese are like, no, we're not going to back down, but they're forced to back down. But then Great Britain starts to get up in there and starts stirring the pot, and they're like, hey man, if you want to go fight, we'll sell you these battleships and you guys can go drag the Russians. And Japan's like, yeah, we're feeling that. And so Japan had gotten itself on war footing, but they'd also like industrialized and modernized. They
Right.
did all sorts of great stuff. Meanwhile, like we said at the top, Russia is just living on past glories, and there's not even a lot of past glories
I was going to say, what
live
past
on.
glories?
Yes, it's
I think my bigger thing is, how did Britain think that? Because I know Britain still thought of Russia as a threat, but good God, they have excellent intelligence.
yeah. So like,
Why
Britain's
would you
playing
even
the long game?
worry?
Yeah,
Okay.
they're just
Okay.
playing the long game. Like, not to get too far into a side quest, but like Great Britain had this like whole complex about like 3-1 is what they called it. So like if anybody else was trying to get some naval power, they had to have three more ships of whatever their next closest enemy had. So like if Russia builds a battleship, Great Britain's going to build 3. If Germany builds a battleship, Great Britain's going to grow 3. So like anybody who starts to modernize and starts to like step up their game a little bit, Great Britain's looking to project power on them. And at the same time, they're looking to just kind of keep any sort of upstarts hemmed in, specifically anybody who's going to start like kind of cutting into their Chinese trade, which is exactly what the Russians want to do.
Okay, I get like the whole proximity concern with Russia and close to China, but good God, Russia hasn't done anything of winning significance in a long time. And I just thought Britain would have a better grasp of that, but apparently not. So that's fine.
No.
All right. So we're going to get this big Russo-Japanese war, and it starts because of Port Arthur and Russia taking Port Arthur from the Japanese.
Yep.
The Japanese won it back because they actually did earn it. And Russia not wanting to give it back because they need that warm water port that they still don't have. And this is just going to lead to an epic level cluster, at least for not necessarily Japan.
No, Japan's going to like come out of this thing like as a legit world power. And like really what this kind of breaks down to, everything we're going to talk about today, is the Russians were overly confident, right? They're feeling like they're a Western power. They're ethnically and culturally superior. And they're just not like, and I know we're going to be dragging on Russia, so please don't add us, like this is not an anti-Russia podcast, but let's just like be straight about the situation. As we'll see it, like battles like Port Arthur, Mukden, and then the epic naval battle of Tsushima. Like the Russians had no business being on this battlefield. The Russians had no business picking this fight.
I can do a total Rocky reference. I think, is this Rocky 4 is when he fights the Russian?
I think it's like Rockies 3, 4, and 5. When we had Patrick on way back.
No, because isn't Rocky 3 with Mr. T? Anyway, remember whenever he was fighting the Russian, whatever Rocky that was, like that overconfidence you see in that character Drago, because he's like, I will break you.
Yes,
That's the same kind of thing. So another nice little Rocky reference.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, Rocky's timeless. Really,
it is.
Yeah, and like really, it turns into, like you said, it's an underestimation. To be fair, it's not like the low-level Russian soldier, sailor, like even spy that's spying on the Japanese in the lead up to the war. Like those people are doing their jobs. Like the Russians have always been good at spying. Nobody's going to ever accuse the Russian state of not knowing what's going on, right? They're renowned the world over and have been for a couple hundred years now of like spying and getting intelligence. The problem becomes the Russians don't know how to use this intelligence. They have been so inefficient and inept with intelligence forever.
Good God, so true. And almost like everything. Anytime we hear of a Russian disaster or any kind of Russian defeat, it is because they either have the intelligence and don't share it, or have the intelligence and try to share it, but their system of communication sucks so bad that it gets nowhere.
And it's the same story here in 1904 in the lead up, 1903, 1904. Like they had the intelligence. Now, the Japanese did a pretty good job of like running some feints and stuff, and like pulling some naval training exercises that they wanted the Russians to see. There's definitely some subterfuge. The Russians also had like a big problem in Japan in the lead up. They're gathering copious amounts of intelligence, but most of the spies don't speak Russian or Japanese, so they only speak Russian, and so they're talking to like Japanese sources, and they're looking at Japanese documents. And like, I don't know how to read this. This is too hard. And so they find somebody to translate it. Bad photocopies of intelligence because the translations aren't great. But still, like they were just like straight up wrong. And this is a great time to introduce, I think, like the story today. Like as much as we have a hero, there's this vice admiral for Japan. His name is Togo Hayakachiro. Like that is not how you say that. We're just gonna call him.
We're gonna call him Admiral Togo.
Admiral Togo. Exactly. You Thank you. Your head and my head are in the same place on this one. But here's what the report said about Admiral Togo right before the
whose report?
war. the Russian report, this intelligence report. It says, quote, he's ill-informed on questions of tactics and strategy. The permanent squadron maneuvers poorly under his command, end quote. Like, they're basically saying this guy has no idea what he's doing. Yeah. And when he gets out there in the open ocean, his boats are just going around willy-nilly. And we're going to find out that this could not have been more wrong.
I know.
I mean, and these are the sorts of seeds of overconfidence, though, that grow into this, like, overgrown jungle of incompetence that swallows up the Russian army and navy in 1904 and really in 1905.
So it all starts, and so I think we should get to where it all starts. It starts again with this Port Arthur, and the Russians are in control of Port Arthur. And what the Japanese have a two-part plan for Port Arthur. They want to blockade or at least neutralize the Russian forces at Port Arthur via the sea, but they also want to bring in a land force to take control of the base at Port Arthur. That's their goal, right?
Classic maneuver. Yeah, Port Arthur's out on a peninsula too, and that's kind of key here. Is that the Russians are going to have to defend this wide open harbor, but they're also going to have to defend like this peninsula of land. Like if they get cut off, they're going to get cut off. Right. And so that's it's a tough place to defend.
And their goal, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, their goal was they knew that the majority of the Russian fleet was in the Baltic Sea. And their plan was, if we can neutralize the Russian forces at Port Arthur before that Baltic Sea, group comes in for reinforcements, then they would have a really good chance of keeping that port. So what happens in this whole siege and everything else? Are the Japanese successful?
Yeah, they are. They're brutally successful, frankly. The Japanese didn't have a lot of ships. Remember, we're talking about a country here, a state that's only been in this like quote unquote modern like footing for 30 years. They had 6 battleships. They're getting them from the British. They have like 10 heavy cruisers, 40 destroyers. They had captured some German ships from the Chinese during the Sino-Japanese War that the Chinese had bought. I mean, they're stacked, but this is what they've got. This is Admiral Tojo is bringing everything he's got to the siege of Port Arthur. The Russians have 3 total fleets. They have a Black Sea fleet, a Baltic fleet, and a Pacific fleet stationed at Port Arthur. And so, like you said, the Japanese were in a race against time. They needed to neutralize Port Arthur. They needed to neutralize the Port Arthur fleet. They needed to keep that fleet hemmed into the harbor area surrounding that peninsula. And they also needed to provide enough cover for those landing forces, like you talked about, those land forces, to get in so that they could actually seize the port, because the port has some pretty epic level naval batteries that could blast Japanese ships if they get too close. So Togo's going to have to really be on top of his game. And remember, the Russians think this guy is inept. The Russians think this guy has no idea what he's doing, right? But Togo has, processed the intelligence. He has processed the information that's out there. He knows exactly what he's up against, which is a Russian force that's slightly larger than his, but not as high a quality. And that's from an armament standpoint, but also just from a leadership standpoint as well.
So if I'm the Russians and I'm already in control of Port Arthur, all I want to do is be able to defend it until I can get reinforcements. That's all I want to do. Right? So
just stay in tight, bring the Japanese into you, and then blast them every time they get in close.
From the batteries, right?
That's it.
So is that what happens?
No. As soon as Togo shows up, right, because he's got to make the attack, so he's got to show up to the battlefield. The Russians rush out of Port Arthur and attack him. Right, they get outside of the range of their own naval guns, and they make a run at the Japanese fleet. Now, when we talk about this, listener, anybody out there, imagine these battleships are all lined up in like a straight line, like you're like back in the day when you used to wait in line at the lunchroom. Right. And everybody's just in this queue, one ship after the other. And we're talking about these old school ships with these guns that like they're all over the place. But for the ship to be most effective, it needs to be perpendicular to whatever it's engaging, because then you can bring the vast majority of your firepower. So both naval lines are going to come at each other, and then they're going to engage in this like complex circle sort of dance until one line can get perpendicular to the other. And what you want to do is you want to catch your enemy with all of their guns pointing straight forward, which means that they can't really engage you, but you can engage them all up and down your line with the broadside, right? And just blast away. This is called crossing the T, and it's super hard to do. Like
because
any good commander is going to
not let that happen,
exactly.
right? Because and for our listeners, if you think about a capital letter T, the goal is, if you are that what I call the vertical part of the T, if all your ships are lined up from one side and the other side can come perpendicular to that, it's a disaster for the other army because you can fire on with so many different angles. So apparently Japan crosses the T.
Oh yeah, Togo crosses the T big time, and he does it really quickly actually. And in fact, the Russian ships they'd come out. They get crossed up. Togo blasts and blasts and blasts. He forces the Russians back in, and then he sets up a bunch of sea mines. And then the Russians come out again in this like foggy, misty, hazy sort of weather. And there's just like another engagement. The ships run into the mines, and they start getting blown up. They're outside of both naval forces are outside of the battery range at Port Arthur, but everybody's watching the sea battle. The Japanese sneak up from behind. They seize Port Arthur because the Japanese have that huge land force.
The land forces,
Yep. And what ends up happening? The Russians lose Port Arthur almost immediately. And remember, this was the prize, right? This is what everybody's fighting for. And so right off the bat, the Battle of Port Arthur goes the way of the Japanese. The Russian fleet is destroyed, and what's left is captured by the Japanese. So now the Japanese have actually grown their naval forces so that they can run some defensive maneuvers at Port Arthur, but still have a fleet that's going to be able to engage the Russians, who, like you said at the top, are coming from the Baltic to reinforce the Port Arthur. But that's going to take like 3 to 6 months for the ships to get there. So losing Port Arthur so quickly was devastating for the Russians, right? That's what you get when your training regimen is eating processed cheese, right? They didn't show up ready to fight.
So, and I know this is that the Russians do take their Baltic fleets and they do send them to Port Arthur because they want to recapture it. They're not just going to let this go. That's a warm water port, and we know in Russian history how important that is. And so when they send in their Baltic fleet, their goal, I think, I've read about this, their goal is to get to Vladivostok, recoup everything, and then take it to the Japanese.
Yeah.
But the problem is, to get to Vladivostok, you have to sail by Japan.
Yeah, you got to sail right through Japan, right between a gauntlet of Port Arthur on your left and Japan on your right? Because you're going up north to Vladivostok. And so you're going to have to run this gauntlet, and you're going to do it through this small strait called the Straits of Tsushima. And the Strait of Tsushima battle is like epic naval warfare battle. It's the first and only battle that features almost exclusively steel battleships, and steel battleships will rule the battle. This is it. This is all this talk about the ancient battleship.
This is the final fight in
exactly,
Rocky.
right?
Yeah.
This is the first and last battle where this will ever happen, because when we get to World War I, no one's going to risk their battleships, in large part because of what happens at Tsushima. And then in World War II, the opening salvos, the Germans are going to send the Bismarck out, and they get sunk. It's great battleship.
Yeah.
And then all the American battleships get sunk at Pearl Harbor by air power. And it's clear by 1941 that battleships are no longer the kings of the sea. It's the aircraft carrier. It's air power or submarines. Yes, This is it. This is this awesome battle that everybody had been training for 100 years, and it happens one time, and here it is.
So if we're doing the Rocky IV analogy, this is the big final fight between Rocky and Drago.
Yeah.
All right. And so the Baltic Fleet, I know, does get in and does try to get through the Straits of Tsushima. They do. They have to get to Vladivostok. They have to, because we have to remember that these Russian ships have come from the Baltic, and those of you not knowing of the Baltic are world history students. A, that makes me want to cry, but B, it's up near like
Sweden and Finland and Norway.
Finland, right. Like it's a long distance. And so because a lot of the Russian fleet was outdated and because it was such a long journey,
4 months.
These ships were not in prime condition once they got to the Straits of Tsushima. The men were tired. They hadn't been able to resupply the way they wanted to. They hadn't been able to get the coal they desperately needed to run the ships as much as they wanted to. So this is like a tired fleet getting ready to attack Japan, who has had plenty of time.
Yeah, exactly. And
exactly. Regroup. Yeah.
And so Togo, he's waiting, and he, obviously knows the situation here. He's waiting in Tsushima with a large naval force, waiting for this Baltic fleet to try to run the gauntlet. Right. And not only was he there and waiting and he was ready, but he had advanced warning for when the Russians show up, because the Russians show up, they're sailing up, and they're well out of range, like visual range of the Japanese ambush fleet. However, they're talking on the radio, and the Japanese have little listening stations on the islands inside of the strait, and the Japanese pick up the radio chatter, and they realize really quickly that this is military chatter, and it's not like fishing boats or the merchant marine or anything like that, because they're talking about like the size of the fleet and which ships are there, all this stuff. Like they're called codes, Russia. Like try to use them sometime. Like even my daughter tries at 6 years old, tries to use rudimentary codes when she's trying to keep something secret from my wife and I. Like she knows the code messages, but apparently the Russians didn't think that it was a problem. And then to compound the problem here, the Russians think the Japanese are like us technologically, which means even if they're listening in, how are they going to get the information to the ships, because they don't have hard lines to make the communication.
They didn't understand they were using wireless. Gotcha.
The Japanese had wireless, and again, gets back to that whole cultural superiority, that kind of quote unquote white man's burden, ugliness of this time period. Those guys can't have wireless. It's a new technology. They haven't figured it out yet. Wrong. So Togo knows. Right. Togo's waiting. Admiral Togo is waiting. He's already crossed up the T once. He's already devastated the Port Arthur fleet, and he's immediately in better naval position, because as soon as the Russians show up, the line shows up in Tsushima, the Japanese fleet comes out from their hiding spot and utilizes their superior speed, right? Because the Japanese ships built by the British are faster.
Fast,
they're sustaining 15 knots whenever they want to. The Russians top out at 12 knots at short bursts. And so Togo pulls up parallel to the Russians, has his broadside, blam, 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 blam. He hits the Russians fast and then pulls out way in front of them. And the Russians are like, oh, I think they're gone. We must have scared them off. Meanwhile, what's Togo doing? Everybody at home that says crossing the T is correct. He crosses them up, and he does it in this foggy, misty sort of late, I guess early morning, not late evening is probably the way to say it, May morning. So it's really hot and steamy and foggy and stuff. And the Russian ships emerge from the fog, and they're sitting in this perfect blasting position for the Japanese. And the Japanese just start engaging, bam, 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 bam. And they just start lighting up the Russians, right? And so here's the thing, right? Because I want to get back to this, because I think it highlights again everything that went wrong for the Russians, is that in crossing the T for a second time, Togo does something that not even the vaunted legendary British Admiral Horatio Nelson accomplishes. He crosses the T twice in one war. Nelson did it one time, right? Lord Nelson from Great Britain, fighting Napoleon, Battle of Trafalgar. He does it one time, and they name a square after him. He's got a giant statue on top of this huge pillar. It's 500 feet in the air. It's ridiculous, the level of love that the British feel for Nelson, because he crossed up the T one time. Now, Togo's done it twice in 6 months.
So I'm going to guess the Japanese win this battle at Tsushima.
So yes, it's going away. So the first time, so again, They go parallel, blam, blam, blam. Then they cross the T, boom, right? And then the Russians like
Right.
feint around it. Togo disperses his forces. The Russians are like, oh, we can just run the gauntlet. Let's just get through here. And so the
Hurry up and get
Russians
there, yeah.
take this like feint, like, oh, Togo doesn't know what he's doing, but Togo has set another trap. So when Togo disperses his forces, like, because he was in that, like you said, that upper capital T position, he breaks
Right.
that T in two, kind of like he lost control of his line to let the Russians through.
Yeah.
But really what he's done is he's given himself space and time to get it back in front of the Russians again, and he crosses the T on them for the third time. He does it twice in one
What?
battle.
You would think by that stage of the game, the Russians would have somewhat of a clue that this guy knows what he's doing. He was able to take Port Arthur. He's crossed the T twice. Like, what would possess you to think, oh, no, those were just lucky.
He clearly lost control of the line. What idiot, right? You have more chance. Like you could have won the Powerball. More, you have a better chance of that than like if you're in a real naval war than getting crossed up twice in one battle, let alone 3 times in one war. But this is what Togo does, and so he blasts down the flagship of the Russians. When it's all said and done, the Russians lose 16 of their vaunted battleships or heavy cruisers, right? These are the top of the line. So not only is the Port Arthur fleet destroyed, that Pacific fleet, the Baltic fleet is totally destroyed, right? The Russians had like 40 some odd like destroyers and torpedo boats and all those sorts of things. And all but 3 of them are chased down and sunk by the Japanese.
That is one decisive victory.
I mean, and it got to the point where it was so obvious what was happening that the Russians decide they're going to scuttle their own ships. They're going to sink their own ships instead of letting the Japanese take them. And so, like, the losses are compounded on top of that. And so ships that maybe would have gotten away, the Russians panic because they don't think they have a chance of actually making it in. And meanwhile, Togo has withdrawn all of his like prized capital ships because he doesn't need to. And he's got smaller torpedo boats that are like flanking in and around all these battleships. And this is when, in these small like engagements with these torpedo boats, are when the Japanese lose their first ships of the Battle of Tsushima. When it's all said and done, the Japanese will lose 3 torpedo boats. That's it. That's it. And meanwhile, there's 25, 30 Russian ships sitting at the bottom of the strait.
There's like no Russian
They're done.
anymore.
They're down to 1 fleet left. They got to save it now. It's the Black Sea Fleet. That's it.
Yeah. So I can't imagine that the Russian people are really thrilled about this, right? Because I know we had talked in the previous episode that Russia, even though Russia was attempting to modernize and industrialize, it was like some half-ass effort. Like it wasn't working. And as a result, the workers in Russia were having terrible conditions. Even the peasants who were still working the farms having terrible conditions. This can only exacerbate that, right? Like this is not good. So not only do you have domestic problems, now you've got foreign policy problems, and it's just like an epic level disaster for Russia and the Russian people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this war couldn't have gone more wrong. We talked about Port Arthur and Tsushima. There's also this huge land battle, the Battle of Mudkin, which, like, for anybody who's paying attention to this war would have realized, like, exactly what World War I would have been like. I mean, Mudkin involved, like, nearly 600,000 soldiers. It tops over 600,000 soldiers. There's over 160,000 dead at Mudkin. I mean, this thing was, like, it was obvious what modern industrial warfare was going to be 10 years before, I guess 9 years if we're being fair, 9 years before those first engagements of the First World War in Belgium. But like the reality is that the Russian people are just not feeling this level of loss, right? We already talked a lot about how, like you said, all these failed reforms and how Russian people were like the poorest of the poor and they're living in this backward society. And we're going to talk about this next episode when we talk about Bloody Sunday. But like the people, like, even with all the bad at the beginning of 1905, they're still like feeling that nationalism. They're still feeling their czar in particular. And it wasn't until the events of Bloody Sunday occur that the Russian people start to turn their back on the Romanov dynasty and start to, like, you know, begin the end of that 300-year-old tsardom in Russia. But we're going to need a lot more time and space to get into what happens in Russia. And then, we'll also we need to touch a little bit on Japan, but this is it. I mean, Japan, for all intents and purposes, is now punching with the big boys.
Yep, they're at the big boy table. Yep,
they have arrived, and it's one of those things of coming out of the Russo-Japanese War. You can see that powerhouse that eventually is going to try to flex in 1930 and 1940 at the beginning of World War II. Right, they're that power. They have arrived.
But that's a story for a later day.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you once again for joining us today in our second part of our Russo-Japanese War series. As always, if you enjoy our podcast, we encourage you to listen to more of them. You can follow us on Spotify, iTunes, Instagram,
all the places.
Anchor.fm. Yeah.
On the internet, you know where the internet is. This is where you find us out there. Get the pod, subscribe, please. We're trying to make something of this, right?
So we look forward to our final part of our 3-part series in the Russo-Japanese War. And as always, thanks for listening to us. Until next time, see you later.
Bye.